Welcome everybody, and thank you, Diane and Farrell, for always having these really grounding presentations on the history. As some of you know, Farrell creates these presentations to give context to all of the different presentations we've done, and he's done it again here, and thank you so much, and also to the team. So as Diane said, I'm a member of the team. I've known Diane and the team for a long time. I've also been doing a lot of research over many years about reparations, particularly to African descendants of slavery, or ADOS, and you can look up that acronym. There's a lot of information about that movement. I'm going to be interviewing Trevor, who's here, and thank you, Trevor, for agreeing to be here. He will introduce himself. He has a really interesting background. He does research into reparations from various angles. To me, this presentation is fundamental to everything, and in some ways, maybe we should have done it before looking at the GI Bill and redlining and everything else, because this is really the root of everything up to the moment. It's a stepping stone toward November, when we're going to do a reparations demand. And I hope all of you can come to that race retreat. More information will be given about that. I also want to take this opportunity to thank Farrell for talking personally about his great-grandmother. It reminds us that this discussion is not just the cold, hard facts of economics and finance, which of course are embedded in that system of the slavery, of the economics of slavery, but it's also about people. It's about the Black people who were and are being damaged today by it. It's also about the white amassing and hoarding of wealth, which continues today as part of a system, whether whites are engaged in it. And I include myself when I speak about whites who are benefiting. Whether they're engaged or not, they are benefiting, and this whole system needs to be essentially restructured, but it cannot be restructured until we have a better understanding of really where it grew from. So I want to acknowledge that trauma to people and the effect of this deep cruelty over centuries, really, not stopping at emancipation, but up to this very day. And I especially want to point out that this trauma becomes deeper when particularly whites question and are sarcastic and ironic, I guess, about the legacy of slavery and calling it ancient history. So Adam, if you could put the first slide up, and I'm just gonna help Adam along as I'm speaking, so. I think there's a little bit to come down here. There we go. So basically, this presentation is really for us to understand and contemplate the economic and financial legacy and business legacy of slavery, and how it still impacts Black families, but what I want to, and Black business, but what I want us to keep in mind is also how it has benefited at the same time. We tend to erase whites. We keep looking at these things happened in a passive way to Black families, Black businesses, and the descendants. And there's a very active side to this, which has to do with white families, white businesses, and we'll get into that more. What I also want to say is that a lot of this research that I've done, there's nothing special about what I've done. It's just something to me that's fundamental to this situation in the US and actually Europe, Canada as well. And there's a lot of research and data. Raphael Bostic, who's the president of the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta, I read an interview of his, and he was talking, he said basically, and I quote, "A lot of research creates a lot of knowledge, but his goal and ours is to activate that knowledge. It's not to keep perpetuating journal articles and articles, but to move this into action." Next slide, please, Adam. Now, many of you might recognize this cover of the Atlantic. It's the extremely famous and influential article by Ta-Nehisi Coates, "The Case for Reparations." I bring it up because it reminds us in a very succinct way of the time frame we're talking about. We're talking about the 250 years of slavery, but the theft of skill and expertise, the theft of land, the theft of of labor continued after that. In a way, Pharaoh touched on it. So I want to keep that in mind, that we're talking about a system that has continued to this very day, and 250 years of slavery, 90 years of Jim Crow, 60 years of separate but equal, and 35 years, well, probably more now. This article came out a few years ago, and we need to reckon with this. And that's what we're trying to do here with the Racial Justice Collaborative. Next slide, please. We talk about generations, and Pharaoh talked about generations. And I have always like, what is a generation? We kind of throw the term around, and I kind of researched it. And generally economists and others who look at history and the through line to the present, they look at it as 25 to 30 years, which is interesting. It's the span typically, I mean, obviously that's just an average or a median. The span between the birth of a parent and her child or his child. And going back to what Pharaoh said, you think about this, you look at elders, African-American elders and white elders for that matter, born in 24, for example, and still alive today. The African-American elder could have been the grandchild of someone born into slavery in 1864, as someone they knew and they loved growing up. You know, Pharaoh knows his great-grandmother, and whatever trauma she inherited, whatever knowledge came to her about her forebears has reached into his family. And again, I put the same of the descendants of enslavers. There are whites today who are linked fairly closely to enslavers, enslaver families. I use it enslavers, you could say slaveholders. So it's important to keep that in mind. I bring up this issue of Zora Neale Hurston. A book of hers recently came out, even though it's based on her 1930s interview with a particular formerly enslaved man named Cudjoe Lewis. You can look him up. He brings in his interview, and she uses his own words, he remembered his experiences, and more so, he remembered the broken promise of the 40 acres and a mule, which we've discussed, which was a promise to attempt to repair the formerly enslaved people that eventually came to nothing. Next slide, please. I wanted to bring up this book also. It's called The Half Has Never Been Told. I'm not sure why we can't see the whole sleeve, but it's the author, Edward Batiste. This book to me is extraordinary. He reminds us in his book, while he's looking at the economics of slavery, he keeps going back to the people, the revolts, the uprisings, the pushing back that went on all the time. And in this quote, I think it captures it. He said, instead of being individual misfortunes, enslaved people realized their own experience was part of a giant historical robbery, a forced transfer of value that they saw every day in the form of widening clearings, cotton bales moving toward markets, and the slave coffles heading further in. Now, the context, I'm sorry, African Americans were not confused about what they thought of slavery's expansion. Pharaoh touched on this huge boom in cotton with the gin and so forth, and that it expanded slavery and internally within the United States. And this quote and this giant historical robbery is what this refers to. And when you read this book, he uses the voices, the direct language of the formerly enslaved in their many memoirs and interviews through the 1900s, to talk about what they remembered. I also wanted to point out another example of closeness. So in the 1990s, I was a journalist with the Boston Globe, and I met a Black journalist who was in his 80s then. His name was Mabry Doc Counts, Kountze, in Medford, Massachusetts. I think he was 84 at the time. He wrote a memoir, and he did a lot of research into his family, but essentially his grandfather, whose name was Hillard Counts, had been born into slavery in Virginia. And so Mr. Counts, Mabry Doc Counts, knew his grandfather. And I was sitting at a table in his home in Medford. And again, we go to touch the hand. This was back in the 90s, of being that close to someone who is himself so close to the period of slavery. The next slide, please. So I want to hear, these are just, I know it's a lot of writing, I'll try and just get through it, but essentially I want to talk about the centrality of slavery, that the slavery and the subsequent, almost 200 years of economic and social brutality, the effect it had on descendants and the descendants today. But it also, we have to look at it again. What did it do? The wind in the back, the economic wind in the back of white people, white enslavers, their descendants, their businesses, and the growth of their businesses after emancipation. We often hear from whites, and many of you have probably heard this, including immigrants who are white or white presenting immigrants saying, we came here later, we didn't have anything to do with this. Well, to be honest, they entered a system already set up for them. Italians, Jews, Armenians, others Irish, who initially were not considered white. This is a little bit aside, but eventually came to be seen as white. They all eventually have benefited from this. And as some of you were here at our prior event, the land grants, the GI Bill, the free education, the Homestead Act, all of these programs serve to really propel whites and white society forward at all levels, not just the wealthy, but those who are not wealthy, who became wealthy. And as you may recall, Lane himself and Diane, each of them did very personal, very emotional and difficult presentations about how their own families were benefited or were hurt by this. Finally, I want to talk about economists, and I've been reading a lot about what they call the moral imperative of economists, that economics, the study of it, is not this neutral, as people like to think, this neutral science. Power and capital played a huge role, obviously a mainstay role in slavery, and it still plays a role in capitalism today. And essentially, Professor Derek Hamilton, who I don't quote him, but the idea that he brought up is that power and capital adjust to alter the rules and structures of transactions, meaning the markets, to privilege that very power and capital. So it reminds me of a time, let's say those of us here who run businesses, who work in businesses, imagining having a business where you largely have no labor costs. And due to the theft of early land as well from Native Americans, and also, by the way, the theft from Black farmers, we'll talk about that at some other stage of land. Imagine really running businesses without those costs. It's really something astounding to think of. And that's really what went on back in the day. And finally, I know economics and finance are cold and it makes our eyes roll back in our heads perhaps, but we need to sit and figure out how to try and understand this the best we can as non-economists and non-financial people. And I can guarantee you, I am not an economist or a financial person in any sense of the word, but I have tried to link myself to people, economists and academics I trust, in order to understand really the depths of this situation. So one of the things I want to impress upon you here is seeing Raoul Peck's Exterminate All the Brutes. It's about slavery, but the global colonial theft of land, it's extraordinary. It's an extraordinary work, and it will help you. It will really help you understand this. Next slide, please. So this is just more a reminder of how finance and economics are tied to the base of slavery, of the slavery era, the economic slavery era, and as well as to the reparations movement. Again, we are doing this in aid of understanding why reparations are fundamental to changing the society, and that, 100 million here from Netflix or 150 in scholarships from SoftBank, et cetera, the things we read that companies were doing after the George Floyd murder, those are choices those companies are making to move 1 or 2% of their wealth. That is not reparations to me. And frankly, it doesn't totally impress me at all. We'll talk about that near the end. And I'd like all of you to think about that as well. One of the points here is that US slavery itself, the production, the entrepreneurs in slavery, they created a lot of the accounting and operational systems that companies use today. And I won't go into those details, but that all of that information is available. And here's, for example, an annual record of a planter. You see it says the planter's annual record of his Negroes. This is in 1850, and the value of the people at the time. We need to come to terms with the importance of this to really understand the magnitude of the theft and how whites, whether purposefully or not, continue to benefit fully from what was created. Next slide, please. Here we go. I mean, this is just reiterating what Farrow said. It's showing the movement of between the continents, between the US and Europe and the African West Coast. There are American corporations now, and we're going to look at a few that have their roots in the antebellum years, and that is a site of potential redress under reparations. Insurance companies sold policies, and which we will look at as well, and to underwrite the lives of enslaved people, and also underwrite the slaving voyages, whereas any of us know who've studied history, we completely know what happened on those ships. There were uprisings, there were people who jumped overboard and commit suicide. So those enslavers and owners and the owners of those ships, or the organizers, were compensated for that. Railroads used slave labor and profited from transporting cotton or rice, tobacco, etc., that was produced on plantations, what I call labor camps, or are called by other people as well. Keep in mind, the people that were being brought were kidnapped and brought from the West Coast. Many of them had amazing agricultural skills, particularly around rice and yams and so forth. And those people brought those skills to the United States, and enslavers knew very well what they were tapping into. It was not just, as people like to say, labor, although of course there was labor, but there was skill and expertise that came over. Next slide, please. I just want to quickly describe what is a predecessor company. We're going to see that word. There are companies today that were directly implicated in the slavery era, but really not that many, because many of them changed over. So when you look at an entity today, and some we'll talk about, a predecessor company is a company that no longer exists in its original form, but a company now acquired its assets. Those assets were built through the slavery economy, and therefore the company today benefits from that predecessor company. Some modern day companies are also benefiting because they came in. A lot of companies will say, well, we didn't exist, you know, prior to 1865. Well, if they're in any of those listed categories and many others, they benefited. They opened for business, riding a boom after emancipation and into the Black Code area, where there was still basically de facto slavery, if not de jure, meaning legal. Next slide, please. We want to look at two areas today. And again, we're just touching on it. There's really no way to do justice to the depth of this, but essentially, in my view, at least in my research, I won't say it started with the California Department of Insurance. They have a slavery era insurance registry, which we're going to look at. A lot of material that we know today about the bankers, and particularly the insurers, came out of their requirement, which we'll discuss later, of companies having to disclose their slavery era ties if they want to do business in California. Now, I can guarantee you the Aetnas and the MetLifes and all the names of the big insurers that we know, the AIGs, they have to do business in California because it's a huge market. So we're going to be looking a bit at the details. And all of this is leading up again to the Q&A with Trevor to discuss these and maybe in broader strokes. Next slide, please. So here we look at New York Life, which we all know that these are almost household names, right? So I just want to touch on a few points here, which you can also read. Essentially, they reported to the state of California that they have a predecessor called Nautilus Insurance Company. It began writing insurance policies in 1845 for a period of 2 years until their trustees voted to end those types of policies. But nonetheless, 339 of the first 1,000 policies written by Nautilus were on the lives of enslaved people. And these policies were for about 500 or less for a term of 1 year. And then we talk about the numbers of people and the claims that were made just on these policies. Now, keep in mind, this research and the reporting to California and again to a few other states, which we'll go into, is really just the tip of the iceberg. It's what those companies were forced to do to research, to disclose to California in order to do business there. Next slide, please. Here's Charter Oak Life, which still exists. I bring up this quote. The company, this is a quote by, it's in a, I'm sorry, I didn't put the full context. It's in an article in the New York Times, which you can find online, called Slave Policies, but it's written by Matthew McGill, who was a Kentucky-based agent for a Hartford-based insurer. And this was in a pamphlet where they were trying to drum up business in 6 southern states. And he said, the company is by no means solicitous of securing a large Negro insurance business unless the owners are careful and judicial men. So he's really saying, you know, we want your business, but we're only going to do business with whatever, you know, he determined were the careful and judicial enslavers. So there's some irony and to this comment. Next slide, please. Here we have AIG, another huge multinational. It acquired a company in 2001, as you saw, that comprised 17 insurers licensed to do business in California. Of the 17, as reported to the slavery era registry in California, the Department of Insurance, only one of them, called United States Life Insurance Company, which was in New York, did business during the slavery era. Now, when I say only, again, keep in mind, this is the tip of the iceberg and only what they were required to report. Now, AIG did research and they located a magazine article that contained a replica of a policy of ACG, and it was on the life of a man named Charles for $550. And it's interesting when you look at the exclusions. So some of us know when we buy insurance policies, you know, we won't cover flooding, we won't cover this, we won't cover that. In this case, the exclusions were death to said slave by means of any invasion, insurrection, riot, civil commotion, or any other military or usurped power, or in case the slave shall die by his own hand, or in consequence of a duel, or by the hands of justice, this policy shall be null, void, and have no effect. So you see, when they talk about the hands of justice, what are they talking about? If this man named Charles tried to escape and was killed in a slave patrol operation to go try and get him back, he wouldn't be covered. So again, it's interesting to think about really how these all these exclusions, including the exclusions related to the uprisings of enslaved people, they were not covered in this case. Next slide, please. Here, Aetna, a very, well-known company to this day, they filed their report to California on behalf of 4 companies authorized to do business in California. One of them, they uncovered 7 policies. You can read that here. They produced a list of 16 first names of enslaved people culled from those policies. Again, interestingly, and we'll look at this quickly when we actually look at the report from California, most of the names of the enslaved people were a first name. When you saw a second name, and you'll see some of these, it means that, in touching on what Farrow said, there was a huge US internal movement of enslaved people being sold from one enslaver to the next, moving as the cotton industry grew. So they end up taking the name of their first enslaver, and you might see a second name on the ledger book. Next slide, please. This is, I'm sorry you can't see it very well. This is embedded in the California Slavery Era Registry report. I will urge each of you, when you can, to go read that report and read what's in there. There are a lot of primary documents like this. So this, just in case you can't see it well, is a list of insurance premiums by age of the enslaved person, together with any extra premiums like for mining and other steamboats where enslaved people were forced to work and where there was a high chance of injury or death. And again, this is a reminder that this document is an original that is part of the California Department of Insurance Slavery Era Registry. Next slide, please. We're looking now, moving from insurance to financial entities, again, names we know very well. In 2005, so JP Morgan Chase was the largest bank at the time. It admitted that two of its subsidiaries, not even predecessors, but subsidiaries, meaning existing in the moment, had accepted enslaved people as collateral for loans. Now, as we know, what is collateral? It means if you have a loan and you don't pay up, you have a house and you don't pay your mortgage, eventually the bank takes it back. Well, enslaved people were put up as collateral. Now, if plantation owners defaulted, they took the enslaved people. So what does that mean in reality? When you read the book by Edward Batiste and other memoirs of the lives of enslaved people, they were moved around like pawns in this. Again, families were torn apart because of this. This, when you read it, sounds cold and calculating and economics, but basically this is what happened to people. They were taken by the bank. Who knows what happened to them, where they were sent, and so forth. An interesting note, please, the source here. So there's this article, but also in New York City, there's something called the Inside Out Tours, and they run a New York City slavery and Underground Railroad tour that really links Wall Street to slavery in a way that probably many people don't know. And out of that, I also was able to confirm that New York City probably received 40% of all the US cotton revenue through money from its financial institutions, shipping, and insurance companies. And again, it goes back to Pharaoh's point that no one in the North can just look at the South and poo-poo them as backward, former enslavers. The whole of the North is completely engaged, or was completely engaged, and today I would argue is still engaged because they grew from this. Wells Fargo, Citibank, Bank of America, all the banks we're with, they are all well-known US firms that benefited from the slave trade. Again, those are things that you can research and find yourself. Next slide, please. Here is another one that essentially, this one I find so interesting. So the Daily Journal of Commerce, which happens to be in Oregon, in 2002, a shareholder in Fleet Boston Financial sent in a complaint about this very large lawsuit, a series of lawsuits that were going on seeking damages for the descendants of African-American enslaved people from Fleet Boston and other institutions. The response was from Edward Fagan in Livingston, and Edward Fagan was the attorney filing the suits. I'm sorry, I can't see the entire thing here, but basically, this was the response to that complaining shareholder. They say that this is an example of legal system run amok, meaning these slavery reparations cases. Fleet Boston, its officers, directors, and shareholders and depositors wouldn't know a slave if one bit them on the nose. This is in quotes from, I believe it's lower down in the, why can't we see it? Hold on a second, because let me find it, because I'd like you guys to be able to research this. 1 second, please. Yes, so the lawyer, or the response, was that this is an example of the legal system run amok. However, according to the suit, Fleet Boston was a successor to Providence Bank, and Providence Bank, founded by slave trader John Brown, allegedly, he says. So in other words, he doesn't believe the facts. There are documents that they lent money to John Brown to enable him to finance his slave business, which had to do with shipping and many other things. So he uses the word alleged. Then he continues the response to this complaining shareholder, quote, Fagan intends to file close to 100 additional lawsuits against large US corporations for damages in excess of trillions of dollars, which is true. That is what happened. The cases were lost and you can review them. But here's his aside. I wonder if Fagan will sue Egypt for enslaving the Hebrews and forcing them to build pyramids. So I go back to this, my initial comment, which is there's this sense of poo-pooing without understanding the depths of this. And I think that poo-pooing the role of slavery in building all of this up. And I think that comment really that sarcasm goes to that point. Next slide, please. Here's Chase Manhattan again. Chase Manhattan, it has two predecessors, the Merchants Bank of New York, the Leather Manufacturers Bank of New York. They were listed as the exclusive bankers. Remember the time period, 1852, a 2.5 million venture in writing enslaved slave insurance, life insurance policies on the enslaved. So here we have banking and insurance together. They invested, as we say here, in this company out of London that wrote policies on the lives of enslaved people in DC, Virginia, and North Carolina. You see how specific the details are. And we name here some by name, some very well-known and the wealthiest individuals who are on the board of directors of this venture. I want you to note the source here. The testimony is attorney Deidre Farmer Pellman. She went to law school to do slavery reparations class action lawsuits, and she was a lead plaintiff in this case in 2004. There's a lot of information about her. She has a reparations organization. I tried to get her to join us. She was unavailable, but you can find lots of information about her and everything she's done. Please go to the next slide. Now, in Raoul Peck's Exterminate All the Brutes, he talks about a Haitian anthropologist, Michel Rolph Trouillot. He wrote a book called Silencing the Past, Power and the Production of History. I think the title speaks for itself. He again is from Haiti, and he looks at this in a global and colonial way, and obviously touching on slavery. He said the ultimate mark of power may be its invisibility, and the ultimate challenge is exposing the roots. I would say that exactly exemplifies the issue with what we're talking about today, that the mark of power, in this case, white supremacy and all its related entities, want to make this invisible. And our challenge is to expose it in the face of people having a lot of difficulty kind of paying attention and taking an interest, people in Congress, people who have power to change this situation. So I just think that this particular book and this particular person, Dr. Trouillot, speaks to that point. And the question I'm going to be talking with Trevor about in part is why is this erasure? I think it's obvious, but I think it's worth talking, putting it out there. And how do we counteract it? Next slide, please. Now, this is a document that has become my Bible. I'm going to show it to you. It's here. I just want to talk briefly about it. I believe Catherine has put it in the chat, and I would urge you to go look at this document. I explain what it is here. The section of it, 138013, says the descendants of slaves whose ancestors were defined as property, dehumanized, divided from their families, and whose ancestors' owners were compensated for damage by the insurers are entitled to full disclosure. Notice what's embedded in there. I mentioned it before, but I'll say it again. At emancipation and after, enslavers lost their property. Let's look at it that way. They were compensated and repaired, not every single one, and repaired for their loss. Imagine that. And imagine at the same time, the enslaved people freed promised 40 acres and a mule and whatnot. There's a history of reparations claims from before 1865, which you can look at. Essentially, they didn't. And so California, God bless them, took it upon themselves to put it out there. They are linking the past to the present. They are providing a through line through legislation and regulation. What I want to point out here, when you go to look at this document, it has a full report, but it also lists all of the individual policies by number when possible. So you look at this, if you can see it, I'm sorry if it's not clear. There are 57 pages of slaveholder names. You see the names, you see their county, you see the name of the enslaved person, and you see their county. You see what job they did, what labor they were forced to do, what they were insured for. And then you see that information was submitted, in this case, for example, New York Life Insurance. So these are all listed A to Z. Some pages have just the name of one insurer. There's one where it's a mill, and they just have pages and pages of policies. Next slide, please. Oh, sorry. Before we talk about this slave, in that same report, there's a list of the enslaved, 47 pages. They are likewise listed A to Z, and it's the name of the enslaved person, where they were, what their job, and what they were insured to do. And going back to the enslaver, for example, in the report, in this listing, there's a Richard Bradley of Savannah and William Burke of North Carolina. They had 11 policies for enslaved people they owned who worked in their sawmill. So it's pages and pages of New York Life Insurance Company policies. They also had cooks, laborers. I'm looking now at the types of jobs. And so the question I have, which I'd like to discuss, is we have everything we need to identify families, businesses. And when you read about reparations, particularly William Darity, Professor William Darity, an economist who's considered the father of reparations, of the reparations movement now, along with other very fundamental organizations, you know, he talks about, yes, federal government, local government, they need to pay up. But there's also companies and private families. I'm afraid to say it, but these people seem to have been kept safe, but their information is out there. All of these enslavers have descendants. Well, where are they now? How much did they inherit? How wealthy are they now? Or if they're not wealthy, you know, what are they doing now? What were they able to accomplish because of this? And so that's something we have to think about. The information, everything we need is out there. We need to figure out how to have Congress or the courts have failed so far, move this along and get reparations for the descendants of these enslaved people who are in this one report. Imagine what else is out there. Let's continue to, I think, the second to last slave, and then we'll launch into our Q&A. This is an example of, and we're only going to touch on this, a number of states and cities, and Detroit is the latest, very recently, maybe last month or in June, they've decided to launch a reparations committee. Chicago requires vendors in certain industries that want to do business with the city of Chicago, they have to disclose their slavery era business. So I put up an example here of their regulation for this, and you can go online and find the actual form and what it asks and what these vendors have to disclose and provide the city in order for the city to approve them as vendors. They're called, I guess in Chicago, they might be called affidavits, but you know, Connecticut has some, other places in Illinois have it. There are a number of states and cities, not enough by any measure, but they're out there. And what they do is they lift the veil on what really no one has wanted to really discuss. And when I say no one, I mean white families, you know, wealthy families, white companies, white-owned companies, multinationals. And I think this is really the heart of it. Next slide, unless there are none left. This might be the last one.
This is the last one.
Oh, thank you, Adam. Thank you. So anyway, I haven't had a chance to look in the chat. You can take this down. Adam, thank you so much for doing that for us. I haven't had a chance to look at the chat, but I hope people will, we're gonna have plenty of time to talk. So those of you feeling antsy and feeling emotional, which includes me, we'll have a chance to get things off our chest. And also push back. I mean, push back on me, push back on Trevor, push back on others if you want to. Anyway, Trevor, hello.
Hello. Hey, everyone.
How are you doing?
I'm doing great. How is everyone else this morning?
Excellent. Well, I'm good, and I hope everyone else is. I want to give Trevor a chance to present himself. He's just going to take a few minutes. He may be doing other work with us in the future. He's quite an amazing person. I have to say, I know, Trevor, I don't want to steal your thunder, but he has a newsletter or a blog called Reparations Daily-ish, which I recently found and joined immediately. He puts out the most wonderful and informative information. And this is what led me to him. And I'm very happy that we were able to find Trevor. So Trevor, go ahead and talk a little bit about yourself, and then we'll just launch into the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Jordana. And hey, everyone, appreciate you all being here this morning, and I'm glad to be with you. And so, as Jordana said, my name is Trevor Smith. I'm calling in from New York City. My pronouns are he, him. I'm originally from Germantown, Maryland. I'm a first-generation American. My parents are from Freetown, Sierra Leone. So I'm coming to this specific work, the work of reparations here in the United States, as an ally, because I believe that reparations here in the United States should go to those who are the descendants of the formerly enslaved. So again, I'm coming into this work as an ally. And I think that's not to say that I don't believe that reparations are owed kind of across the Black diaspora from a variety of actors, but I'm coming into this specific work as an ally, and just always kind of say that up front. For work, I am currently a program associate at the Certain Foundation. The Certain Foundation is a 100-plus-year-old racial and social justice foundation, family foundation based here in New York. And I sit on the Inclusive Economies team. And so we have a $9 million grant-making portfolio that we dole out every year to organizations seeking to create a more equitable economy. And it's been very interesting to work in philanthropy, considering the way that wealth was created in this country, and working for a social justice foundation. And so I've been there for a year and a half, and it's been a very interesting place to learn, grow, and obviously try to create a more equitable world. I will be starting as the director of narrative change at Liberation Ventures, which is a new social venture that is seeking to expand the field of reparations through 4 levers. And I will drop their link into the chat so you can read a little bit more about them. Obviously, it's a social startup, so we're always looking for donations and the like. And so would love your. And so as a director of narrative change, I will be creating what we're calling the Reparations Narrative Lab, which is essentially a space for the organizations that are, the grassroots organizations that are working on reparations on a day-to-day basis to come together, kind of be grounded in the theory of narrative change, learn about the history of narrative change throughout the reparations movement, and then co-create reparations strategy, narrative change strategies together. And so I'm very excited about that, and I'll be starting in 2 weeks. I'm also an active writer, researcher, and I would say a cultural strategist around the issues of the racial wealth gap and reparations. Dr. Darity has been named a couple of times. I'll definitely bring him up in some of my answers during the Q&A. And so I've been published in some research alongside him that kind of examined the role, how much, examining the cost of what a reparations plan could look like here in the United States. And so I'll drop that into the chat in a second as well. And then I've also been published in some outlets such as the American Prospect, USA Today, and Business Insider. And so I'll likely touch on those articles throughout the Q&A, and so I'll drop them into the chat as well. And so I just really appreciate you all having me today, and I'm looking forward to our conversation.
So thanks, Trevor, and we're very grateful to have you and to have your time. Just to tell everyone, after Trevor and I are done with our chat, we will have time to talk. And I also want to remind people, as we've done with other events, and Trevor, you're welcome to leave right at the end or stay. We have a kind of an after party where whoever wants to stay can stay. And we kind of have a free-flowing back and forth. I intend to stay. And we usually, some of the best stuff often comes out there. So I just wanted to remind people that if you can stay a little bit, you might enjoy that. So Trevor, I want to touch on some points from Pharaoh's presentation and from mine. And I also, and I want it to be somewhat free-flowing, but I want to give context to the question. So I want to go back to Dr. Trujillo, his comment from his book, that history is the fruit of power and the ultimate mark of power may be its invisibility, and the challenge is to expose the roots. So this idea of separating the slavery era from today, or trying to erase its role in slavery, you know, building contemporary US wealth, to me is an example of power dictating history. The power structure today wants to just set it aside. It's old. Let's not worry about it. Oh, by the way, I just want to remind people, Catherine is dropping each question in the chat. So if you want to read it to remind yourself, please do. And thanks, Catherine, for that. So my question to you is, you know, which might seem obvious, but again, we should bring it into the light and the air, is why is this erasure or diminishing of the role of the slavery economy? Why has it happened, and how do we counteract it? I know it's a big question, but if you can just touch on your thoughts.
Yeah. So I think, yeah, you started to get into it a little bit. You know, those who hold power, you know, realize the importance of whitewashing history. And so I think this question really touches on what's going on right now with this kind of anti-critical race theory moment that we're seeing across the country. You know, you have 5 states that have signed anti-critical race theory legislation into law, and I think at least a dozen others that have proposed similar bills. And so only a handful of these bills, I think, actually mention critical race theory by name in the legislation. And so I think it's a perfect example of why it's a Trojan horse. You know, most of the bills actually condemn and sometimes penalize the teaching of history, the teaching of facts as it pertains to race and its impact on today's society. Some states have particularly targeted New York Times and Nicole Hannah-Jones's The 1619 Project. I read an article last week about a teacher in the South who, I think it was, I want to say Georgia, who lost his job because he introduced his students to Ta-Nehisi Coates' The Case on Reparations. And so I think the answer to this question is, you know, the folks who are in power are really trying to, make sure that things like Ta-Nehisi Coates' The Case for Reparations and Nicole Hannah-Jones' 1619 Project, which distill history in, I think, a very digestible way and change the common narrative that we're taught in school around slavery, race, Reconstruction, and white supremacy. And white supremacy is a term that I wasn't really introduced to in a school setting. I'm sure a lot of us on this call weren't introduced to in a school setting. And so folks are really trying to make sure that pieces like that aren't in the classroom because they speak truth to power. And so I think that phrase speak truth to power originated from the Quakers, and it was a call to the United States to stand firmly against all forms of fascism. And so today, speaking truth to power can look like a lot of things, but most notably in the kind of bucket on race and racism, it's really naming that this country was built on stolen indigenous land by stolen African labor. And so that sentence is a fact, that sentence is a truth, but yet it makes people uncomfortable. And, you know, it really goes against this narrative that we're taught about American exceptionalism, that our founding fathers were geniuses. And so speaking truth to power, you know, scares people, and it scares the people who are in power, which are generally white men. And so I think that's, you know, the reason why they do it is because they know that speaking truth to power will actually bring to light the things that will empower people to create change, and how do we counteract it? That's what I hope to kind of do in my new role at Liberation Ventures as the Director of Narrative Change, kind of push back against these dominant narratives around American exceptionalism, around this idea of the American dream, and actually create new narratives that actually tell the truth about the United States. And I feel like if we can do that, then we can build power to pass policy.
And also, it sounds like the reparations narrative lab, just to follow up, is going to be gathering the strength of many grassroots and other organizations that eventually it's a power source, right?
So exactly, that's exactly how I envision it. Yeah.
Okay, that's excellent. So I want to touch on this idea of economics, accounting, financial tools, how they were actually created within the slavery era economy, and they're completely embedded in capitalism now in the U.S. economy and its wealth generating engine. But those are like dry topics. We look at police brutality and other things that really spark the imaginations and the emotions of people. But I think this should be sparking emotions in people. And my question to you is, given how either people don't have the patience to they're like, I'm not an economist, I don't know anything about running a business, I can't learn this stuff, I just can't. How do we get people, particularly white people, to be able to pay attention so that we, meaning me and white people, come to understand exactly what happened and how we as white people continue to benefit today, whether we want to or not, whether we like it or not, and whether we're aware of it or not?
Right. So I think this is the golden question. And I don't think there is one distinct answer in terms of how do we get white people to pay attention. I think there's a variety of answers and a variety of methods that are going to have to go into it. But I think that's the golden question. And so Liberation Ventures has actually done some polling, and we're going to do a larger poll soon that found a few things, the poll that was already done. So it found that a majority of US voters support a national reparations policy, including 7 in 10 white voters under the age of 45. It found that most white women support a national reparations policy, and then along with 44% of white men. Then it found that 88% of Black voters and 60% of Latino voters would support reparations. And so this may come as a surprise to you, but I think it was all in the way that the question was phrased. So the question was phrased as reparations in the forms of investments into the Black community for affordable housing, healthcare and wellness, educational scholarships, loan forgiveness, and business development. And so support dropped when the question was just around cash payments. And so I think that's kind of the debate on like what reparations is and what it should be. I think that should be determined from those who were harmed. I personally think that it should be in the form of cash payments in addition to other things. But to get white support, I think we need to create this like a reparative environment. And so I think as the polling shows, white people are more in favor of uplifting the Black community when it's in the form of affordable housing or educational scholarships or loan forgiveness. And so I think engaging in those conversations will be super important, one. And then I think we also need to think about what Derek Bell said. We talked about critical race theory before. And so Derek Bell is one of the founding fathers of critical race theory. And he came up with this term called the interest convergence theory. And that found that Black people will only achieve civil rights when the interests of white people and Black people converge. And so the signature example of this is kind of Brown v. Board, which happened because it also advanced white interests too. And some of the biggest winners of affirmative action, like to this day, have been white women. So what I will say is that, in the fight for reparations, we're going to have to get white people to see and understand, and most importantly, feel that this will also benefit them. I truly believe that reparations is a form of healing to this country, and it will actually set it on the path to live up to the ideals that it espoused in the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. The Declaration of Independence said all men. I think we should amend it to say all people are created equally. that they're endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So I think reparations actually sets us forth on that path. And I think we have to get white people to understand that. And that is how we do that is the hard part. And it will take like a multitude of strategies.
So thank you, and thank you for the statistics you gave us. So my next question kind of rolls into what you've said, and I want to bring up the economist, Professor William Darity, who I know you have written with and you know. Just so for those of you who haven't heard of him, his book is called From Here to Equality, Reparations for Black Americans in the 21st Century. He literally he goes through the history, but he has a section, he literally goes through what he proposes to be the method, which I find interesting. Remember, I said at the beginning, we can have all the knowledge and research we want. If we don't activate it, it just sits, it sits there and does nothing. And I think Professor Darity actually has a plan to activate it. And he's considered by many to be the father of the current reparations movement. He describes in his book what was lost through slavery and Black Coat and Jim Crow. He talks about labor and property, education and skills building, esteem and empowerment, life, liberty, and dignity. He said that the slave redress movement has to focus less on victims and more on the perpetrators and their beneficiaries. So keep that in mind when whites say, well, I wasn't involved. Though you're not a perpetrator, but you are a beneficiary. And so he's saying we have to shift the focus there. So my question to you, Trevor, is when whites, and you've heard the argument say, I had nothing to do with slavery. You know, I'm not a rich person. I'm an immigrant who arrived whenever, well after slavery. Like, why should I be punished? We hear that language that a lot of white people see reparations as a punishment to them for something they say they're not involved in, and that they even say they don't benefit from it. So I was wondering what you think about that.
Yeah, and so I just dropped into the chat volume 31 of Reparations Daily-ish, which was a Q&A with Dr. Darity. I've been connected to him for a couple of years. I would consider him a mentor of mine, very, very nice guy. I just reached out to him over Twitter, and we had our first conversation, and since then, he's brought me onto projects, and so I really appreciate his thoughts on this work, and a lot of what I say really does come from him. And so I'll respond in the way that I think Dr. Darity would respond, which is that the racial wealth gap is the cumulative and most telling effect of centuries of past racist policies and structural racism. And so white people hold 10 times the amount of wealth than Black people do. And we've seen throughout the pandemic how important wealth is when you might lose a job or you might have healthcare bills that just stack up. Having generational wealth is there to serve as a cushion. Yeah. I've personally, I've seen folks, I go to the same high school, we study the same thing, and I come out of university and grad school with tons of debt, and they come out, in the green. Their parents, they got to live at home. While they went to school, their parents paid for their education. And so they come out in the green, even though we were on very similar tracks. We went to the same high school, we studied we had the same major, but then coming out of college, we're in very different positions. And so the racial wealth gap, I think, is the cumulative effect of centuries of past racist policy. And so I think the argument that, it's not my fault, or it wasn't, it's not my ancestors, I think it's most likely to come from white people who come from kind of lower socioeconomic classes, because it's hard for them to see the effects of structural racism maybe in their everyday lives. Because when they look at their bank accounts or when they look at their salaries, they don't feel as if they have benefited from previous racist legislation, or they don't feel as if they benefit from their white skin. And I guess I can understand that, but it's, not really the truth. Yes, there are white people who are out there who may not have accumulated wealth directly because of slavery, but white people are in a better position to attain wealth because we live in a society that's dominated by white supremacy. So studies have found that Black applicants are half as likely to receive a callback or a job offer as equally qualified white applicants. Black men with no criminal record fared no better in the labor market than white men who were just released from prison.
Wow.
A survey of employers found that the reasons that they cited for not hiring Black men were lack of work ethics, self-presentation, a threatening or criminal demeanor. I think folks may have read it too. I read a recent article that a Black family's home appraisal went up $92,000 after taking out all signs in their house that they were a Black family. And so the perception of Black people really impacts them in their daily lives in a way that white people in their skin doesn't impact them negatively in their daily lives. Right. So the implicit bias that is still there within society impacts Black people. And so, your ancestors may not have ever owned Black people, or you may have immigrated here, but that debt is owed from the American government from instituting past racist policies and creating this atmosphere of anti-Blackness that still affects Black people today. Right. What's really curious and what's really funny to me is that no one really complains about how their tax dollars are used in other kind of frivolous ways. Our tax dollars go to Trump's Space Force. There's an actual Space Force. Our tax dollars, I was looking into this before the call, our tax dollars go to Ivy League colleges. Despite the fact that they have billions of dollars in their endowments, between 2017 and 2019, the 8 Ivy Leagues received $9.8 billion in federal grants. So no one complains about these things, but when it comes to giving Black people agency, when it comes to righting a wrong, then it's wasteful spending. Oh, don't use my tax dollars in that way. Oh, don't use my money in that way. It's not my fault. But the government uses our money in all sorts of ways that I may not necessarily agree with, but that's what is part of being in a democracy. And then I should add that, no one also says anything about reparations that were given to Japanese people, after they were sent to internment camps. And so there's this large layer of anti-Blackness that comes up when talking about reparations for Black people. And so I think that that's another layer that we have to deconstruct as we talk to white people about why reparations are needed.
Right. Thank you for that. I also just wanted to add to what you were saying. You talked about the wealth gap has really appeared, in an exorbitant way during the pandemic. So, for example, the Washington Post on May 25th, 2020 reported that the number of working Black business owners fell 40%, far more than any other group. And the second thing I want to point out, because I'm very incensed with banks, is June 4th, 2020, US banks took 11.7 billion in overdraft fees in 2019. Now, what does that mean? This is while banks are giving away 150 million in scholarships. They collected 9% of account holders with $350 or less in a balance paid 84% of those fees to banks. And of course, when you look deeply into the statistics, and according to this newspaper article in the New York Times, the people most affected are clearly poorer people of all races, but lots of people who are Black and Latinx. So they paid banks, and the banks closed their accounts and then continued to still build up their deficit of these $35, overdraft fees. So I don't know about you, but all of this, post George Floyd, we're going to do this and that. That's the next thing I'm going to look into. But I don't think, and like you said, Trevor, it is the people affected who should be able to dictate how they want to receive their reparations. And again, I would suggest that 150 million here, 100 million here, the businesses are deciding how they want what they consider to be repairing or helping, to me, should not figure into a discussion of reparations. That's a whole other thing. So, I just wanted to add that to what you said. I also wanted to ask your opinion. In my presentation, I talked about Chicago and California and these disclosure requirements. I think, they got press at the time, and I think there needs to be more of them. Detroit is going to start a reparations committee from what I've been reading. How influential are those though? Because we are talking about state and city governments putting it all out there now and requiring people who want to do business with them to disclose. And I was wondering what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah. And so I just dropped into the chat, a Q&A that I did with Dr. Andre Perry of the Brookings Institute, where we kind of talk about this. So if folks kind of want to dig into that a little bit more, we talk about it there, this idea of local reparations. And so Dr. Darity is actually very against local reparations. He's very adamant that reparations should come from the federal government. He often says that the total amount of state budgets combined, isn't enough to close the racial wealth gap, with our calculations. And so I'm looking for another article that we wrote where we calculated it in a report, but then I kind of distilled it down into an op-ed in Business Insider where we give various figures into how much reparations are owed. And so the figure that I like to use is the $12 trillion figure, and that really is calculated based off of what 40 acres and a mule would be today. And so that would give each descendant of the enslaved $254,000. So the idea of local reparations, I go back and forth. I think local efforts are needed. I think we need to create like a reparative economy, a reparative society. But I kind of would lean toward Dr. Darity in terms of reparations should come from the federal government, or should be led by the federal government. But I can't really fault private institutions for looking back into their history and being open about it. We've seen universities like Georgetown identify the descendants of people who the university sold to keep it alive, and then they offered free enrollment and free tuition to the descendants of those who they sold. We've seen churches acknowledge the role of slavery in their congregations. We've seen cities like Evanston, Illinois, kind of do what I would call maybe like a housing reparations. They're kind of calling to part their role in redlining, and they're giving funds to Black people in Evanston, but it can only be used for a down payment on a house. And so I think these local efforts are needed to create the groundswell so that we can, eventually see something happen at the federal level. I think with other kind of large policy changes, that's what generally happens. It kind of grows from the bottom and then eventually reaches Washington, D.C., where we see federal legislation. And so that's why I'm really adamant about culture change. I think we need public-private and philanthropic support to change how people view reparations so that reparative efforts can be made across the country. But we do need to be really clear on what we mean by reparations. And so I'm fine for all these reparative efforts, but I think I've seen some things like mutual aid where folks are just sending donating to an organization or sending someone money and they're calling that reparations. I think I don't think that's reparations, and I think that's very dangerous because it actually waters down what reparations are. And so we have to be super careful about it. There's debate. I'm happy to engage in conversation and debate around whether we need local reparations, whether we need federal reparations. Is local reparations such a thing? Where I stand is that I think most of the things that we're seeing happening on the local, state, and personal level are reparative, and that reparations itself should probably come from the federal government.
And so I wanted to add something. The word reparations kind of bothers me. It has repair in it. And when you repair something, it means it was once whole and it broke. This was never whole. It's always been broken. And I don't know. I just wanted to put that out there to make, that word reparations, even that word doesn't really work for me based on what I said. I wanted to point out, you gave examples, Brown University and so forth. Again, they are choosing the way they want to repair, which I think is wrong. If you guys look up the Virginia Theological Seminary in Northern Virginia, it's a very interesting case because they actually did approach the descendants of the people that they sold, and they asked, what do you want? And they allowed the people damaged and affected to decide. And they've actually started issuing monthly checks. Now, I want to be clear. My personal opinion is things can never be repaired. The damage is so deep and so wide and so generational, and what was taken from people, opportunities, you can't even repair it, in my view. But we do have to start somewhere, and the US rolls on money. So let's do that and help close the gap. But fundamentally, the destruction, the separation of families, et cetera, over all those centuries can't be repaired, in my view. So I had one more question for you, which is part of your research as well. And it relates to Professor Darity saying that reparations can't succeed until the animosity of whites, quote, is not only reduced, but converted to support. Mm-hmm. And then I also wanted to link to that the role of truth and memory. Mm-hmm. So I wondered what you think of what he said. He's essentially saying if we can't get whites on board, this isn't going to happen. Right. And also, where does truth and memory come in, which is also a big push of Diane in our group, and talking about things and giving air to them so that we can move on into action.
Right. Yeah. And so this is what I hope to kind of dive into a little bit more in my new role as the Director of Narrative Change at Liberation Ventures, where I'll be starting in a couple of weeks. And so, I fully agree that this can't happen without white people. I think the way I think about narrative change and kind of getting people on board is that you have your choir, which is essentially folks who have joined us here today, who are probably in agreement. I'm assuming everyone here is likely in agreement that reparations are owed to Black people. So that's the choir, right? The folks who, agree with us already. Then you have your base of supporters who I think are, generally aware of racial inequities. They generally support racial justice, but it's not top of mind for them, essentially. And then you have the persuadables, which AKA moderates, which could go either way. And so I think what it's really important that we expand our base, and that we move by moving some of the folks from the persuadables into the base, and that we increase the choir. And so increasing that choir will also need to bring in other people of color. And so we really need to create a multiracial coalition of folks to get across the finish line. And so that means we need our Latinx brothers and sisters, we need our Asian brothers and sisters, our Indigenous brothers and sisters to advocate for this, because there's three imperatives to this work. There's a democratic imperative, an economic imperative, and a moral imperative. And so Bryan Stevenson of the Equal Justice Initiative said that reparations is for all of us. If you've harmed someone, you have to do things to become healthy and whole. That's the case for reparations. For me, it's all about how society heals from injustice. And so that's what Bryan Stevenson said. I think you brought up a really good point, Jordana, about the concept of repair, and even where it stems from. The Latin word reparare means to put back in order, to restore. And so I think you made a really good point there. But I would generally agree with Bryan Stevenson that, reparations is for all of us. This is a societal issue because the societal harm has been caused. And that impacts our democracy, our economy, and our social lives, and how we interact with each other. And so anti-Blackness really, shaped America. It's really steeped within America. And so naming that and bringing people along and naming that, and then naming reparations as a solution, I think is really important. And so in his book, From Here to Equality, Darity also talks about the role of repairing the national memory and consciousness. Mm-hmm. And so I'm currently writing, I guess I just finished it, thankfully, it took like 2 years. I was writing a chapter in the book that Darity's putting together that takes like a multidisciplinary look at reparations in various sectors. So there's a housing chapter, a criminal justice chapter, et cetera. And so my chapter focuses on media, and it examines how Black people have historically been negatively portrayed and demonized through various forms within the media landscape, and then also how essentially like Black art and Black intellectual property was kind of stolen from these media conglomerates and profited off of. And so that's kind of two parts of the chapter. So I think to address this issue of like truth and memory, we need certain things. And so again, I think not all of these will be called reparations per se, but they're like reparative efforts. And so, for instance, I mentioned the anti-CRT legislation earlier. I think we need some of the opposite in some like blue states, like here in New York, that kind of mandate that you have to teach an anti-racist curriculum that accurately, teaches the history of slavery, Reconstruction, the failed project of Reconstruction, or the failed project of Reconstruction, and doesn't just skip to the end of the civil rights era. I didn't learn about COINTELPRO until college. And even then, when I learned about it, it sounded like a conspiracy theory to me. I was asking myself, how could the government infiltrate the Black Panthers, and how could they see dissent and assassinate people? That doesn't sound like America to me. That was literally my thought process. So, I think some would call that brainwashing, this idea of American exceptionalism, where me as a college, I think freshman or sophomore, could learn about COINTELPRO and question it, even though it's a real thing, a history that happened. So that's one way. I think we obviously we need to get rid of all of the monuments commemorating Confederate Army officials and schools that commemorate them, and bridges like General E. Lee, and replace them with Black movement figures. So, not just Martin Luther King, but other leaders such as Queen Mother Audley Moore. She's kind of, I would say, the starter of the modern reparations movement. Audre Lorde, W.E. Du Bois, Sojourner Truth, Harriet Tubman, and others. And so I think we need to tear down those monuments and replace them with Black movement figures.